Thank you. Well, I'm going to provide a little bit of a broader perspective, yes, but not just that it's interesting what's happening or not happening outside the scholarly sphere, but more importantly, because what's happening outside the scholarly sphere is going to affect the scholarly sphere. So you need to be aware of these things happening because sooner or later, it'll have an impact on you. So why is this? Well, obviously the world is interconnected. That's a trivial observation these days. But the very fact of the kind of interconnectedness that the internet and the web have brought us intrinsically leads to interdependence. And that's not a bad thing, because what that means is you don't have to start from scratch when you're developing standards or building technologies. What we see most often now is these standards and technologies don't just grow up out of whole cloth. They build on each other now. So almost never do you see a standard that's developing that isn't paying attention to the other standards in its domain or outside of its domain. And that's because the new mandate is really interoperability. That's what has to happen. And what do we mean by that? Well, basically, enabling systems and processes to remove friction, which results in economy and efficiency and flexibility. And it means reliability. It means that things just work when you move or access content between systems, between devices, et cetera. They're interoperable. Portability. You don't want to have to make different versions of your publications and your files and your content for this device or that device or that device. You want to use the same file wherever you want to access that file. And finally, adaptability, because this stuff changes over time. Your needs evolve, the ecosystem's needs evolve, your customers' needs evolve. So you don't want to have to throw out what you've done and start over. You want to constantly build on what you've done. So I'm going to give you a little overview of this convergence that really has accelerated pretty dramatically just over the last couple of years. And I think it's really an important thing. So again, just to recap a bit here, the interconnectedness leads to interdependence. That requires interoperability. In order to be interdependent, you have to be interoperable. That's what's prompting this convergence of standards, and how that happens is collaboration. So that's really the kind of cycle that we're seeing right now, is this drive toward collaboration and people looking outside their silos and involving others. And it's a multidimensional collaboration. It's a collaboration across sectors. It's a collaboration around the world, various languages, various cultures. As I mentioned earlier, it's standards being based on other standards. And I will give you some examples. So I'm going to start with an area that you may not expect me to start with, which is the area of rights. Because I think a lot is about to happen in the whole rights sphere. So I'm going to give you two contrasting examples. First is a very simple single sector example of a problem that was solved surprisingly quickly, somewhat contradicting Evan's observation of how slowly these things take. This is an example of something that happened really fast. So this is I have to explain to other audiences what this is, but I don't have to explain to you guys what this is. But the fundamental point about this one is it's a hybrid journal. So you have to be able to detect for a given article, is this particular article open access or not? Well, the solution was ALI. It's a NISO recommended practice, and it's really simple, and it came together really quickly, and it's really effective. So there's two metadata elements. One is free to read, and that gives optional start and end dates. So it says, is this thing free to read, yes or no? And the other metadata element is a license ref element that says, here's where you find the licensing terms. It's a stable URI that points you to wherever the licensing terms are. So it could be a Creative Commons license. It could be licensing terms that are served up by your hosting platform, whatever. So that's all it is. So why was that so easy to do? Well, first of all, it's a very homogeneous ecosystem. It's just about scholarly journals. scholarly journal articles. And almost all journal access is article-based, online article-based. And there are well-established support systems, hosting platforms, Crossref, academic libraries. All of these things are pervasive in our ecosystem. And it's only concerned with the article. It's not talking about components of the article. It's not drilling down into the article. It's just saying this thing, this big chunk, an article. And it was easy to incorporate in the JATS metadata header. And the metadata actually travels with the asset because it's right in the JATS. That may not surprise you because it's always been the case for the stuff this community does, but that's totally unlike what happens in much of the rest of publishing, where the metadata is not at all connected to the thing the metadata is about. So let me give you a much more complicated example. A textbook, and actually it's almost, we need to stop thinking in terms of textbooks because the big educational publishers are stopping thinking about textbooks. They're thinking about platforms. So yes, they continue to create textbooks, but they're just one delivery mode of their content, and they're actually developing much richer, much more complex delivery modes that are platform-based. So this is actually an example from Cambridge University Press, which has a big education division. This is a very little book, but on their Elevate platform, there could be a video from Condé Nast magazine. There could be an interview from the BBC. There could be a photo licensed from Getty. There could be an article from that PNAS journal that I just showed you. There could be an illustration that they commissioned from an illustrator. There could be text they quoted out of a trade book. There could be content created by an educator. There could be content created by a student. Well, guess what? What rights did they obtain for each of those assets, right? Because each of those assets was from a different sector of publishing: magazine, news, scholarly publishing, educational publishing, et cetera. What formats are those assets provided in? What metadata came with them? Do any of them have embedded assets that themselves have embedded rights? Like that video from Condé Nast. If it's got Brad Pitt's face in it, now you got another issue because you got Brad Pitt rights to deal with, not just Condé Nast rights to deal with, et cetera. And this is a massively complex problem because the assets are all from different sectors. The file formats may all be different. They don't just plug in. The sectors don't even use the same rights metadata. Most of it is not machine resolvable. Metadata isn't usually in the asset. And a big textbook platform like this has hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these assets in what is, in effect, a publication. So this is really a mess. This is a difficult problem. So it has to be solved by multi-sector collaboration. It can't be solved by one sector because it involves all these different sectors, right? That's the core of the problem, is that it's cross-sector. So I'm just going to quickly give you a little update on some of the rights activities in some of these organizations: BISG, Editor, the W3C, IPTC, Plus Coalition. It's an interesting example of all the work that's being done around this issue, and where right now we've got a real mess on our hands, but there's a lot of work being done to get this under control. BISG, this is the Book Industry Study Group. Their focus is really on authors and agents. So what they're really concerned about is royalty tracking, because they're mainly a trade book organization. They wouldn't like me to say that because they're really a broadly book-based organization, but the reality is they're dominated by the trade publishers. And royalty tracking is a real nightmare, particularly for agents, because they get different royalty statements from all the different publishers, and they've got to figure them out and figure out how to get their royalty statements to the various authors, et cetera. So they created a controlled vocabulary. It's a rich, modular, structured, controlled vocabulary about all these issues associated with managing the rights about this content. And it's designed for machine and human interoperability. Notice that I underlined the word design. I'll get back to that in a second. And they've also developed a payment spec that's related to that, and it's a very complicated, very detailed model that's aligned with that complex controlled vocabulary. And it's based on the Copyright Clearance Standard payment spec. So it started with something that really works in the real world, but it is very complicated. So this is a really excellent example of a good specification that never went anywhere. So why is that? Everybody says, well, it's too damn complicated. Well, why is that? Because the publishers insisted on the complexity. The publishers are who made this standard. Why is that? Because rights expressions and payment specs are inherently complicated. They didn't want to make it complicated. The damn situation is complicated. I'm sorry, I've used damn twice already. I better watch myself. But, so it's complicated. Does that mean we're doomed? No, no, no. Onyx is a very complicated spec. This is supply chain metadata in the book industry, and it's almost universally used now. And it's really rich, complicated spec, and it works fine, and it's used all over the place. JATS is a rich, complicated spec, and it's used, it's taken for granted in the scholarly publishing. So anyway, Editura is an international organization. It governs Onyx for books. You may not be aware that there's also an Onyx for publication licenses and an Onyx for rights information services, less well known and less widely used, but internationally based. And actually, Springer, for example, is very involved in the Onyx PL work, and you're going to see a lot of that starting to impact the journal world if you aren't yet aware of it. That's the piece of it that's going to most start to affect this particular audience. Another thing is that for books and journals, we can live with having to look up the licensing terms, right? Go to that Creative Commons license and see what it says you can do. Go to the hosting platform and see what rights are associated with this thing that you want to use. The news industry and magazines cannot use a system that requires you to read the license. The Associated Press, as an example, and this is one news agency. I'm a member of the IPTC, which is the International Press Telecommunications Council, and it's BBC, it's Agence France Presse, it's TASS news agency in Russia. So anyway, just the AP, one of the members, they produce 250,000 assets every day. 7 days a week, 250,000 individual assets that have rights associated with them. So you cannot possibly manage that without having machine-readable rights expressions. It has to be done by a computer. They've been, AP specifically, IPTC specifically, have been working for the past few years to develop what's called ODRL, the Open Digital Rights Language. This is a framework for machine-readable rights expressions. And it expresses things like policy types and actions and constraints and parties and roles and relations. So whatever you need to say to express about rights, it's really a robust, well-developed system for this. Those few of you in the audience that are actually really standards geeks, I know a couple of you in the audience that I would put in that category, might be the ones that would say, well, wait a minute, that's not really a web standard. And that's because ODRL was developed by what the W3C calls a community group. Anybody can belong to a community group. You don't have to belong to the W3C, but it can't actually produce a W3C recommendation like XML and HTML and CSS and SVG and MathML. Those are actual W3C recommendations. Those have to be created by working groups. Well, guess what? Now it's a working group. As of a couple months ago, it's the Permissions and Obligations Expression Working Group. So it's now been elevated within the W3C. They're taking this ODRL work that was done by the community group, and it's now going to be put into an actual recommendation, and that's really going to be an important factor in adoption, because people, as Evan observed, really want things to be official formal standards before they'll implement. And we do have a chicken and egg problem here, because in many cases, particularly the W3C, there have to be implementations before they will adopt the standard, before they will finalize the standard. You have to prove that it can work and that someone will use it before it's adopted. So it's being adopted by the IPTC. It's part of their rights ML. The magazine sector is planning on using it. They're not there yet. The photo industry, there's this PLUS coalition, really broad membership of creators, mainly photographers, distributors, users, reproductive rights organizations, et cetera, from 154 countries are involved in this organization, collaborating with the IPTC, the Link Content Coalition, the ODRL community group, ISNI. IDER is, by the way, folks in this community think the DOI you use is the DOI. You should get in the habit of calling it the Crossref DOI. There are other DOIs. Most of the DOIs in the world are Crossref DOIs, but this IDER is a DOI for the entertainment industry, and it's a whole different thing. It works in a similar way, but in a different way. ID Alliance is a magazine industry, and why I'm getting to this, you may say, well, why is it getting into this? Well, first of all, photos are part of what you do, right? So ultimately, you're going to deal with this as well. But also, it's a really good example of a really, really broad collaboration to make sure that what happens here is really broadly applicable and robust. And what do all these things have in common? It's the open web platform. What we're finding is that the web technologies and web services are really the context of the convergence that I'm talking about. They're fundamentally what enables the operability that we're looking for. And one thing that's driving that is mobile. So it no longer works to say, well, a PDF is good enough, because when you send that out to somebody who wants to look at it on her phone, it's not satisfactory. So your journal articles are going to have to become mobile adapted sooner or later, and sooner is better. You can't just say your job is done for PDF. And you'll hear another reason when I finish talking and Robin starts talking about why you're going to have to move past the PDF. Doesn't mean you stop doing PDFs. If you still need them, fine. But, well, anyway, I'll move on. So the open web platform, which people often think of generically as HTML5. Well, HTML is actually the structural semantic markup. And many people still think it's about presentation. No. HTML is not about presentation. HTML5 is not about presentation. CSS is the presentation. HTML5 is the structure and semantics. And then JavaScript is the functionality. And by the way, JavaScript technically is not a W3 standard. That's governed by another organization, not the W3C. But it's considered part of this constellation of standards called the Open Web Platform. EPUB 3 is really basically packaged web content. So it's for enabling you to interchange and distribute publications and documents, which are really much more complex than a website, because there's lots of documents, lots of resources, lots of metadata, all kind of packed up in a package. That's what EPUB does, and it's free, it's open, it's inherently accessible, it's non-proprietary. So it's designed for the delivery of publications based on the open web platform. Well, as I've mentioned, I think 2 years ago at SSP, IDPF and W3 started working together to collaborate on trying to get these standards, the web standards and the ebook standards, or EPUB standards. I caught myself making a mistake that I never want to make, which is it's EPUB, it's not ebook. It's not for books, it's for publications. Please remember that. So they've been working for a couple of years toward this convergence. So let me give you a quick update on what's happening with EPUB. Right now we're working on EPUB 3.1, and basically I would say how to characterize it is it basically tightens up EPUB 3 without breaking it. So the spec format's improved, it's better integrated, it deprecates some features that are in EPUB 3 that turn out not to be used. There's an issue about the serialization because lots of people in the web world want to move away from XML and toward HTML. I happen to be an XML partisan in that debate, but there's a lot of pressure to do HTML or both. Clarifying and extending support for remote resources, metadata, fonts, et cetera, that are not in the package, that are not in the EPUB. Improving how CSS works, particularly so that you've got more predictable behavior from creating the EPUB to putting it in the user system and still letting the user have the experience that she wants to have with this. All of that's being worked on, improved, stricter accessibility support, et cetera. So those are the things that are being worked on. Editor's draft came out in April, and we expect to have it final by this October. Part of that, or related spec, is EPUB Accessibility 1.0, which Robin will be talking about a bit more. This, basically what we've done is pulled the accessibility specs out of the main spec and put it in its own document so that it's referenceable by by various other documents within IDPF or outside of IDPF. And so our goal is developing guidelines that enable certification of accessibility and also discovery of accessible features so that you'll know if you get an EPUB what accessible features are provided in this EPUB. It's based on web standards, but it adds a lot of publication-specific requirements that aren't in the web standards, that are specific to putting together complex publications, not just websites. And that we've got in a first editor's draft, just came out this past April. And I'm running out of time, so I'm going to zip past a couple of screens here. I've mentioned to this group before, another thing that's an important initiative in this sphere is what's called the EduPub Alliance. This is a group trying to get standards in the educational space all aligned. So it involves W3C, IDPF, IMS Global, which governs educational standards like QTI, which is quiz and test interoperability, learning system, learning tools integration, LTI, Caliper analytics framework. All of this work, we're trying to get all of this work to align and interoperate. That is resulting in a spec called EPUB for Education, which is an EPUB. In other words, it's completely conform to EPUB 3, but it adds requirements saying, for education, you need to do these things. You need to say, is this thing for the teacher or for the student? You need to say, what accessibility features does this provide, et cetera. So it kind of tightens up the more generic EPUB spec. So in effect, it's a profile. This is something that I think, I'm actually pushing this concept of general specs with profiles. I think that's where we're going to come out on a lot of this work. And Evan gave an example of this as well, where, you know, as these standards try to become as accommodating as possible, they in effect lose specificity. So you can express lots and lots, for example, in your JATS metadata, but that's actually a problem, not a plus in some regards, which is why this JATS for R came along, because it's like, well, wait a minute, I've got JATS metadata, but this publisher's JATS metadata is not the same as this one, or this one, or this one. So you need to profile it to say, okay, if you are going to participate in this sector or use it for this purpose, then you need to do it this way. You're not diverging from the spec, you're just using the spec in a specific way. I think that's a really important trend. And last EPUB topic is BFF. I couldn't resist this slide, and especially because we're in Canada. That stands for browser-friendly format. Not part of EPUB 3.1, but it's something that the EPUB community is looking toward, which is a specification for how to create an EPUB that has no features that are incompatible with browsers at all. Just opens right up. It's not intended to replace classic EPUB, but the idea is it would be round-trippable with classic EPUB. And it's, again, a step toward this closer alignment with the open web platform. So, you know, wouldn't it be great if there really wasn't any difference between an online publication and an EPUB? Well, it's being worked on. It's called Portable Web Publication. It's probably the key example of the EPUB and web convergence that is rapidly taking shape. The concept behind PWP is one publication for both online and offline use. It's the same thing. Same content. It exists in two different states, either an offline or packaged or a cached state, or online, but all the essential resources are still available because they're all linked. So it's fundamentally the same thing, not two different things or not 3 or 4 different things. And then a canonical URL that gets you able to access any of these states. You could say, I've got it offline, I've got it online, but my system just died, but I cached stuff. I'm using it only offline because I want to use it on a plane. It's the same thing, and I get to it with one URL. So we've got this potential of, well, that's what potentially EPUB 4 could be, but we've got, and that's coming out of the IDPF side, and we've got portable web publication coming from the web side. And by the way, the two committees, I'm on both working groups, and I'm not alone. I would say, what would you say, Joshua? Maybe half of the working groups, half of the people on each of those working groups are on both working groups? Yeah. So there's a lot. This is real collaboration between these organizations, and it's been going on for a couple of years. In fact, the chairs of the IDPF EPUB 3 working group are the same two people that are the chairs of the W3C EPUB working group, Svea and Marcus. Both of them chair both groups. So this is real serious collaboration. So where this is leading, and you've probably heard the announcement that was a few weeks ago in Chicago, that there's a proposed merger of the IDPF and the W3C. And the whole idea behind that is that it's designed to facilitate and optimize this. And instead of having two different organizations working and trying to coordinate, let's just make it one organization. And the plan or the proposal as it now exists, and by the way, both organizations have to debate this within their memberships, and the memberships have to vote on this, so it's not a done deal. But the proposal is that there would be a publishing business group within the W3C that would, in effect, be the equivalent of the board of directors of the current IDPF. Well, no, it would be the membership of the current IDPF. And then there'd be a steering committee that would be, in effect, like the board of directors. But in effect, all IDPF members would become members of the W3C in this publishing business group and responsible for kind of ensuring this. And that kind of grandfathering in will be for a couple of years. At that point, publishers will have the option of either becoming full members. Most publishers don't do that because it's expensive. There are very few members of very few publishers that are W3C members. Pearson, Wiley, Hachette are the three most prominent. One in education, one in STM, and one trade. But that's paltry publisher participation. One other big reason for this is that the W3C is putting a real premium on publishing. And so they want to get publishing knowledge and intelligence into their development process, and this is a good way to do it. I've got some more slides here, but I am not leaving Robin any time if I keep going further. So I will just give you a quick update that there's some good work being done on math by Mathjax. The most important thing, I think, well, there's an accessibility tool that you can actually test out now. But the most important thing, I think, if those of you that are familiar with Mathjax, is that it requires JavaScript on the client. What they're doing now is server-side processing so that it will work in any browser or reader. It doesn't require JavaScript on the client. I think that's a big thing. So there's a semantic enrichment project, and there's a project called Annotating All Knowledge. Has about 60 scholarly publishers. Many of the organizations you belong to are part of this. JSTOR, PLOS, HathiTrust, Crossref, Highwire, Wiley. 60 scholarly publishers have signed on to this Annotating All Knowledge project. So I won't go into detail. Maybe I'll do a session on this next year because there'll be more to report on. And then lastly, you may have heard of AMP. This is a Google-driven but not Google project to make web pages load faster in mobile technology. And the thing that I think is interesting is it's a profile of HTML. Same thing we're talking about. It limits the things you can do in HTML while all the things you can do in it are HTML. You can only do these things because when you do it that way, pages load instantly. And the major news organizations are taking it up, the AP, the New York Times, et cetera. Big CMS platforms like WordPress are using this. So anyway, SSP will have my slides, and all the things I've talked about are in these 2 slides here. So you've got links to it. Thank you very much. I won't take time for questions because I need time for that.